Hi, everyone. Welcome and officially good evening. Thank you so much for joining us virtually today. My name is Hala Alawi, and on behalf of Atmosphere Press, I am so pleased to welcome you to today's live author reading of new literary fiction. We'll be hearing from Charles MacDuff Westerman, reading from Where Heaven Meets Cheyenne, released on October 29th. Anne King, reading from St. Catherine of Secaucus, a novel released on February 11th, and Michael A. Luksch, reading from The Dreamer's Quarry, a novel released on March 11th. All three authors' books can be purchased both from online retailers and from select bookstores. And of course, the books can be ordered on Atmosphere Press's website. That's at atmospherepress.com/book. I'm also going to put some links in the chat to all three books so you can easily access all of them that way. There those are. At the end of today's event, we're also going to have time for audience questions. So during the readings, if you've got a question for one or more of our authors, go ahead and type those in the chat and I'll make sure they get them. Please do stay muted for the duration of the event, but feel free to use the chat for any praise and comments in addition to questions. One last note is that we at Atmosphere Press appreciate your support today and always. So if you have a manuscript of your own, we would love to read it. You can submit your work today to books@atmospherepress.com. Again, thank you so much for tuning in and supporting Charlie, Anne, and Michael today. We're going to start off with our first reader, who is Charles MacDuff Westerman. Charlie grew up on a cattle ranch in Chugwater, Wyoming, and graduated from Washington State University with a degree in journalism and English literature in May of 2012. After college, he moved to Portland, Oregon, working as a school bus driver and writing his first novel, Where Heaven Meets Cheyenne, at coffee shops between his morning and afternoon routes. In 2020, he completed the book project with Lighthouse Writers in Denver, Colorado, where he currently resides. The novel we'll be hearing from today, Where Heaven Meets Cheyenne, tells the story of four middle-class American families and how their unlikely fates intertwine. This narrative unfolds through the varying perspectives of five main characters, touching upon timeless themes such as the nature of God, perception versus reality, and finding grace in the midst of hardship. Let's now welcome Charlie.
Awesome. Thank you, Hala. Couple shout outs. My wife is in Kentucky right now, in her hometown, and she's here and she is pregnant with her. We're gonna have a baby boy due June 3rd. So just wanted to give her some credit. She's doing the real work today. I also see Tom Farrell, who was my biological father, who is one of the main characters in the story and passed away when I was very young. Was his roommate abroad in college. And when I was a broke young writer, put me up at his apartment in New York when I was there trying to peddle my book. I also see Peter King is here, and I'm just a big Monday morning quarterback fan, so that's pretty cool. I did not know he was going to be here. As Hala mentioned, my book is written from the perspective of five main characters, all from the baby boomer generation, one of whom was my biological father. This book is very much inspired by my family story. There are some fictional elements to it I didn't want to call it a memoir because there's a lot of grief in the story, and I didn't want, there's four families involved in this, and I didn't want people to feel like I was speaking directly for them as to exactly what happened. And it also gave me some artistic license. But this is the one chapter that takes place from a member of the greatest generation. It's my grandfather, and I'm actually even though I live in Denver, I'm in Philadelphia right now. He passed away on March 1st, and tomorrow my brothers and my mom and I are driving to Wrightsville, Pennsylvania, where he grew up, for his memorial service, and it also happens to be his birthday. So I thought I would read from his perspective in honor of his memory. And my biological father, died when I was a year old. So this was kind of the man in my life who taught me what it was to be a Westerman man. So sorry for the really long preface, but here we go. Chapter 19, When Your Miller Needs a Bud. September 13th, 1991, Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Hank downed his last swig of Miller Lite and considered becoming an alcoholic. He liked his brandy Manhattan before dinner and a glass of red with it, had always enjoyed the little jolt of electricity it gave to life. But he never felt an unquenchable thirst for the potential numbness alcohol offered until he looked over with trepidation at his grandsons, intently watching Robin Yount take batting practice from their seats right behind the dugout, and the empty bottle of beer in his hand carried a weight beyond the absence of liquid. Grief's most winning quality had always been its indelibility. It had a bad habit of making the most simply joyful moments all the more miserable. Here Hank was, drinking a beer at County Stadium on a pleasant Milwaukee late summer afternoon with his grandsons, Jeremy and Mick. A hallmark moment, if ever there was one. The boys seemed to be finding escape in America's pastime. Maybe watching Yount, Chuck's favorite baseball player, made it feel, in a way, like he was alive again for a few hours. Still, all Hank could think was, my son is dead, and how will I ever look at my grandsons without being reminded of that? You want another beer, Hank? Warren asked. Warren was Hank's friend, the newly appointed president and CEO of Miller Brewing Company, and a good man. Hank and his grandsons had Warren's generosity to thank for their VIP seats. He had also funded the 2 cold ones Hank had polished off in the last 45 minutes. Yes, Hank replied, swallowing a lump in his throat. Please. Coming right up, Warren said with a sympathetic wink, then held up a finger to the vendor. Hank was somewhat embarrassed to be out boozing the executive of a major American beer company. But if he stopped drinking, he'd start crying, an act he was determined not to make his grandsons witness that day. Before Chuck died, the thought of damning his tears never crossed his mind. For as long as Hank could remember, whenever he felt like crying, he let them pour without hesitation. It was a quality that never made him question his manhood until he watched his son's brilliant spear race before his eyes in a matter of 11 months, then die. Here you go, Hank. Hank? Yeah. Here's your beer. Oh, yeah. Thanks, Warren. You all right? Fine, thanks, he said, taking a large swill from the bottle. Just got caught up in enjoying the view. He leaned forward and squinted his eyes, pretending to focus in on Yount's swift, sage swing as John Prine's Bruised Orange, Chain of Sorrow, came on through the PA speakers. He watched Yount batter 4 straight balls to the opposite field, but Hank wasn't remotely thinking about baseball. He was thinking about Chuck and John Prine in the Paradise Steam Plant in Muhlenberg County, Kentucky. His twangy voice and titillating lyrics had been the catapult for the whole catastrophe that were Hank and Chuck's political conversations. Before Chuck ever listened to Paradise, he and Hank had begun to have small, relatively civil partisan disagreements throughout his son's senior year of high school. Then somewhere between starting his freshman year at Dartmouth and Christmas break, someone introduced Chuck to the folky songwriter's self-titled debut album, which he practically came to consider the 5th gospel of Jesus Christ. As they sat down to Christmas dinner, Chuck looked across the table and asked his father if he was familiar with a piece of mining equipment nicknamed Big Hog. Of course Hank was. Over the trajectory of his career, he'd worked his way up to the title of head of international sales for Bucyrus Erie, the very company that had sold Big Hog to Peabody Energy for their operation at the Sinclair Strip Mine, which shipped a non-stop supply of coal to power the Paradise Steam Plant. As it was located in the States, Hank himself hadn't been involved in the deal, but everyone at Bucyrus, hell, everyone who worked in the mining industry was familiar with Big Hog. It was, in its prime, the mining engineering marvel of its age, the biggest, most brutish shovel the world had ever seen. So big, Bucyrus Erie had to build it on site piece by piece. Even then, the individual parts were so large, a special spur rail had to be laid to ship them in. Once assembled, it stood about 20 stories high, weighed around 9,000 tons, and was capable of devouring 117 tons of earth in a single bite. It was the strip miner's dream. Then Chuck asked his father if he was aware that Big Hog was the engine responsible for the annihilation of many of Kentucky's proudest mountains, the pollution and devastation of their most beautiful river, as well as the virtual murder of the small, peaceful town of Paradise. It wasn't like Hank had never wrestled with the ethical dilemmas of working in the mining industry. It was true that little towns like Paradise were the peaceful, unfortunate souls in the way of the greater good, and that didn't make him smile. But the coal the strip mines provided beamed electricity to millions of homes in America. Was a warm house a bad thing? Hank had to admit he might feel differently if he'd grown up in Muhlenberg County. And yes, Bucyrus had been the foe of some of the world's natural beauty, but it wasn't like Hank hated nature. Chuck's generation always acted like they owned the block on environmentalism, but it was Hank's and the one before his who designated the national parks. There were still plenty of places to enjoy creation. Idealism wanted a forest in their backyard and a fully stocked grocery store in the front. Reality didn't permit that. Compromises had to be made. The world was both growing and wanting to grow more comfortable. Humanity was tired of pumping its own water, tired of it taking hours for our food to be ready to eat, tired of breaking horses and traveling at 3 miles per hour. Hank landed the job at Bucyrus Erie shortly out of college, and he couldn't have been more grateful for the clutch timing of the opportunity. Right after graduating with an engineering degree from Lehigh, he married Rosie a week later and got her pregnant shortly after, leaving him with cold reality staring him in the face. He needed a good job to provide for his family. Bucyrus Erie had offered him that as an export sales correspondent, and he'd made notable sacrifices to capitalize on it. Shortly after Chuck was born, they asked Hank to go to Brazil for 6 months to try and sell equipment to a big mining operation there. 6 months with no way to communicate with his family but snail mail. 6 sexless months, living, eating, and sleeping in a hotel in a country whose language he didn't speak. 6 awfully lonely months. But it was his chance to move up the ladder, so he went, and when he got back and bent down on his knee to hug his 2-year-old son for the first time in 6 months, Chuck, not recognizing him, backed away suspiciously, turned to his mother and said, "I want my real dad. He's in Brazil." Did Chuck realize how that had nearly killed him? That Hank had once been held at gunpoint in Zaire, almost died in a plane crash in the Congo, had, to fulfill his obligations as the guest of honor and seal the deal, eaten duck brain in China, drank turtle blood in Mongolia, that he'd missed precious time with his family traveling months out of the year to Australia, Japan, Scandinavia, Jamaica, and Chile. Over the next few years, more heated disagreements of this nature ineluctably surfaced at the Westerman dinner table. Until finally, Rosie banished any talk of politics while they ate, or for that matter, when she was in the room. In many ways, Chuck was the son of Hank Westerman. He'd gotten his sharp, analytical mind, his self-confidence with a tendency to turn into arrogance, his playful, affectionate heart. But where the conservative philosophy came naturally to Hank, his son seemed to have inherited more liberal convictions. While it was a difference that played out with hostility in their talks of politics, in other areas of their relationship, Hank had found their polarities as fascinating as their similarities. Though he and Rosie had taken their kids to church growing up, they were never pietistic in their approach to religion. They weren't always harping on the gospel or desperately trying to bully their neighbors into believing Christ and hell as absolute truths. They thought it was a good way to instill some moral fiber in their kids. After John, their youngest, left the house, Hank and Rosie essentially scaled back their attendance to just Christmas and Easter. John and Katie were tepid about their church goings growing up, but Chuck took his little cracker and shot of grape juice with full devotion to the idea. He got genuinely giddy for youth groups and church camps, volunteered on his own accord at a municipal pool helping kids with disabilities learn how to swim, and had read through the entire Bible at least twice by the time he graduated high school. He wasn't self-righteous when it came to his faith, though. Now his intelligence, that he could be obnoxiously pompous about. Boggle, trivial pursuit, risk. Chuck wasn't shy about letting his opponents know they were inferior to him when it came to these pastimes. But his faith didn't turn his heart to fire and brimstone. He really did care about the widows and the poor, really respected them as people, and tried to help give them opportunities to prosper. Rosie used to go into Milwaukee and volunteer with the Head Start program that tutored 5-year-olds in the inner city, trying to prepare them for first grade, so maybe that's where Chuck got some of it from. Wherever exactly it had come from, Hank didn't know, but he was always proud of the profession his son had chosen. And he liked to think that, though maybe Chuck didn't agree with Hank's political views, his father had played a significant role in modeling how to love the people close to him. Yount finished batting practice with one last blast to the opposite field as Prine strummed his last chord of Bruised Orange. Paul Molitor stepped up next into the box in place of Yount. Sinatra sang, It's up to you, New York, in place of Prine. Ah, Sinatra. Now there was something Hank and Chuck never had a problem agreeing on. Old Blue Eyes had been playing in the background as father and son had their final conversation at the Cheyenne Regional Medical Center. And he couldn't fight it any longer. Despite his promise to himself, a tear careened from Hank's eyes. Surrendering, he put his head down, brought a hand to his brow, and permitted his body to tremble. Warren plucked him from the seas of memory as he put a gentle hand on Hank's back and held up his beer bottle. To Chuck. Hank looked up at his friend with a sad smile and echoed the toast, then drained the last of his Miller. Thanks, Warren, for everything. Least I could do. You want another beer? You know, I think I'm all right. How about a story then? A story? Yeah, a good Chuck story. One from before he got sick. Hank thought for a while, and England came to mind. The whole family had lived in Lincoln for 2 years as part of another step up the Bucyrus-Erie ladder. Chuck, 9 at the time, loved the experience. Said he felt like he fit in more naturally in Britain than his native country. We sent Chuck to this all-boys school, Hank told Warren, and one day his teacher was giving a lecture on British history. He kept asking questions none of the boys knew the answers to, except Chuck, of course. Finally, after this happened about 4 or 5 times, the teacher threw his chalk down in disgust and yelled, "Are you all just going to sit here and let this damn Yankee disgrace you and your knowledge of your own country?" The funny thing was, though, he was still a big hit with all the boys in his class. There weren't many circles he couldn't fit into. So the week before we were about to move back to Milwaukee, on Chuck's last day of school, Rosie goes to pick him up. She steps out of the car, and there's Chuck, riding on the shoulders of his classmates as they're singing He's a Jolly Good Fellow. Warren smiled at the end of Hank's story, then turned his head to the man who had appeared before them in the aisle next to their seat. He had a stern, slack face with shifty eyes, a constant drooping frown, and large, round-cornered glasses. His hair was toast-colored, very thin, and Hank wasn't sure if he liked him. The man smiled and shook hands with Warren. Hank, this is Mr. Seelig, the owner of the Milwaukee Brewers. I'm familiar with the name, Hank said, reaching out and accepting Bud Selig's handshake. Thank you for the seats. Not a problem, Mr. Westerman. His face broke out in a good-natured smile, causing Hank to reverse his first impression. Warren told me about the tragedy that has befallen your family, and I just want to say you have my and the entire Brewers organization's condolences. If you'd like, we have some gifts to give your grandsons, and if they're interested, we've made arrangements for a tour of the clubhouse. Hank looked over at Jeremy and Mick, their eyes as big as baseballs, looking at Bud Selig like they did when they saw Santa Claus in the Cheyenne Frontier Mall. I think they'd be interested in that, right, boys? Absolutely, Jeremy shouted as Mick nodded his wooden head so emphatically Hank thought it might fall off. Yount was leaning over the fence, watching Molitor as they were led into the dugout. Thud.
All
Good
right.
cut.
Charlie, I just want to cut in because I want to make sure we have time for our other readers. But thank you so much for that excerpt. That was a great way to introduce us to the characters and kind of understand this interplay that's happening.
Yeah, no
So,
problem. Sorry, I had like a paragraph left, but I know that I can move along. So, yep.
no worries. So, reading next today is Anne King. Anne started her career in nonprofit public relations, and after several years in the nonprofit world, she decided to pursue a career in teaching and writing. She earned a master's degree in liberal studies from Rutgers University, where she also taught essay writing to freshmen and older students. It was considered one of the most difficult classes for undergrads, and students were not allowed to graduate without passing the course. Anne also worked at two community colleges in New Jersey while still teaching at Rutgers. Today, we'll be hearing Anne read from St. Catherine of Secaucus, a story of what happens when the faith you rely on slowly crumbles. Catherine Ricci's fall from faith begins at age 10 when her beloved third grade teacher, Sister Alberta, is killed in a car accident. Catherine tries to stay in the fold by participating in extra religion classes and acts of charity, but when she leaves her Catholic school, she considers herself agnostic and attends a public high school. We'll see more of the story now unfold from Anne herself.
Thank you. Do I have a mic now?
Yes, you're great. You're sounding great.
Okay. So I wanted to introduce the book by saying it's about a girl growing up in northern New Jersey and the influence of Catholicism, and in particular the nuns in her school and her life. There were many stories in the book, but too many to tell. I have chosen two brief passages that make the story whole. The first comes, excuse me, after a tragic early event in the life of an impressionable 9-year-old. Catherine Ricci's life. Then, when she loses her mentor. So this is the passage from chapter 1 that I thought would be interesting. Sister Alberta died in a car accident that summer between 3rd and 4th grade. I was at Sunday Mass when I heard she was dead. She was on her way home, meaning to visit her parents in Ohio, excuse me, when her car was sideswiped by a truck. No one ever said it, but I was sure it was the truck driver's fault. Another nun, Sister Maria Essentia, was killed too, though her death didn't have the same impact as Sister Alberta's, since Maria Essentia was in her 80s and never did much that I saw except sit in a chair on the convent patio fingering a rosary. She went along to keep Sister Alberta company. Father Mark explained at Mass that Sunday. He kind of sounded like he might cry, like he was choked up, as my mother would say. He explained what he knew. He shook his head at one point and said it was a tragic loss. I hope they didn't suffer, he said, and he took a long pause. Then he said, I like to think the sisters were singing a hymn when it happened. I remember him saying, I like to think they were still singing it when they stepped up to St. Peter's Gate. That's really all I remember about what he said, because I started crying then, and my mother, who had been holding my hand, took me home. I was overcome, though, not so much from grief as with anger and disbelief. I remember I couldn't get myself to eat supper that night. My mother put me to bed, sat with me for a while, maybe until I fell asleep. She tried to console me. I'd been crying most of the day. Finally, mostly from exhaustion, I guess, I fell asleep and didn't wake up until the next morning. My mother was a cleaner, a certifiable cleaning fanatic, a restless nag about the room, about my dad's piles of papers and clothes, a fuss budget about the kitchen and the bathroom, and a chronic cleaner-upper. Incredibly, she became even more compulsive when my dad left, the day after I turned 10. After that, in addition to her expansive cleaning duties, she got herself a job at an accounts receivable department of a local Chevy dealership. She worked there all day, then cleaned and washed clothes when she got home. The washing machine was always running. Sorry. There was a permanent Clorox smell in the basement, and every shower I took was a battle for hot water. My mother believed in hot water and bleach, like the nuns at school believed in confession and absolution. I understood that all things could be purified, body and soul. I was 13 when I asked my teacher, Sister Antonia, why she became a nun. I was becoming more and more unsure of my faith as I grew. The loss of Sister Alberta was taking a toll on my faith, turning me into a doubter. I thought that Antonia might guide me, help me hold on to what I'd been taught to believe. I liked Sister Antonia very much. She was so devout, so abiding in her faith, and sure of her mission with the Dominicans. Sister Antonia ran the Student Service Guild at St. Dominic's. All 7th and 8th graders were required to spend one marking period each year doing work for the Service Guild. Because I was trying to be the most dedicated student in school, I worked both full years for the Guild. We visited sick parishioners and elderly shut-ins, bringing them gifts of food collected by the Parish Women's Guild. I liked being in Sister's company, if not in the actual company of the sick and the elderly. She was one of those joyful nuns, like from a movie. She was tall and plump and jolly, and she would sing hymns or Christmas carols as she drove, and always had bags of M&Ms for us kids. She made the old people and their problems bearable for us. She would sweep into the worst surroundings, go face to face with smelly old men with rotting teeth in dirty kitchens, harboring cockroaches, piles of garbage, and she'd hug and kiss them, smile broadly right at them with her big white teeth and her large black eyes, and then she'd commence cleaning up their messes. The other students and I helped her with chores, and she always made us sing a hymn for the old person or the hospital patient who we left then. Then she promised to visit again soon, pack us up in the old blue Chevy Impala that someone donated to the convent, and she started the singing all over again as we drove to the next stop on the Oliver Twist tour of our parish. I asked her one day at the end of the religion class when everyone else was gone, why she devoted her life to something she couldn't see or prove. No, it's not like that, Sister said. It's just something I know is right. But how do you know? I persisted. I just do. It's something I'm sure of deep inside. God has revealed himself to me. Sister told me, and then she went off to lunch. Why her? I wondered as I watched her leave the room. Doubter, skeptic, whatever it was, her words dragged it up to the surface for me that day, the way a fishing line might pull a tangle of smelly refuse. I didn't believe in her revelation or anyone else's. So that's one part of the story that I wanted to, it sort of leads you into the rest. So I had my second reading comes 13 years later. Catherine, now 22, is on trial for manslaughter. She was attacked and killed a man in self-defense and came forward to protect a friend who was about to be charged in the murder. Her attorney, James Morelli, called to the stand a nun who immeasurably helped Catherine's case. So I'm going to read to you from that part of her trial. James did his best. He truly did. I thought he was quite impressive. My mother came up with the nuns as witnesses. I didn't want her to. I thought if anything, they would testify against me. Oddly, it was Sister Roberta who was most convincing as a witness on my behalf. I remember sitting at a defense table in the court that day, day 2 of my 3-day trial, when James called Sister Roberta to the stand. I barely recognized her. She had finally accepted the change of habit allowed by Vatican II. She wore a brown skirt and jacket and a small shoulder-length veil. James asked her to tell the court her relationship with me, then to talk about me as a student, as a person. I couldn't believe what she said. First, she explained what a remarkable student I had been, that when she was asked to testify, she didn't even need to look up my records. She had remembered me as one of only 3 students ever to graduate from St. Dominic's with straight A's. She spoke about my records. She said that St. Dominic's had never graduated a better student than me. Then she told the story I was dreading about the incidents at school. Only she told it wrong. She was mistaken. Sister Roberta said that I, like St. Dominic himself, took responsibility for someone else's crimes. that she suspected me of the offense, but only to be confessed to by another student. She said, "I never denied the accusation or accused anyone else." Sister went on to tell the legend of Dominic, who took the blame for when 2 other boys filled the school stove with snow and garbage. Dominic, though disciplined in front of the class, refused to tell on the boys. He later said he didn't protest his punishment because he was imitating Jesus, who remained silent when he was arrested and persecuted. Hence, he became the patron of the falsely accused. Then Prosecutor Mitchell questioned her. He grilled her about telling lies and the 9th commandment, the one about bearing false witness against thy neighbors. Roberta was ready for him. "I don't believe Catherine ever intended to kill her employer. I'm sure of it. And yes, lying is a sin. And of course, no matter how traumatized Catherine was at the time, she should have come forward sooner." Sister paused then for effect. "But she did finally come forward, sir. She came forward at great risk to her personal freedom, at great risk to her future and reputation, to save the reputation of another. I couldn't be prouder of Catherine." The good news is that I didn't go to jail. After that, the news was not so much bad as odd, and perhaps even somewhat amusing. Amusing if, for example, I hadn't been pressed into serving the poor. Amusing if I said I didn't mind not being paid for my work. Amusing if you think being thrown back to the nuns is amusing. And this is the sentence for her as it was handed down by the judge. "I believe that you were afraid, traumatized even by what happened to you in that office," Judge Harrigan said. He continued, "I've decided to sentence you to 2 years probation, 2,000 hours of community service at Helping House in Newark. I think it would benefit you to be in the company once again of the good sisters. It seems to me that that time of your life when you were under their guidance was a time when you were on the right track. You will work with the Sisters of Charity to help runaway teens, the elderly, and the poor. That's 20 hours a week for 2 years." That's kind of the gist of the story, with all kinds of things coming forward and going backward.
Yeah, thank you so much, Anne. Especially like you said, I mean, we get a little bit of that interplay back and forth. So I think that was a great way to showcase that in this reading.
Thank you.
So, yeah, of course. Our final reader for today is Michael A. Luksch. Michael is a 29-year-old husband and father of 5. He currently lives in a quiet neighborhood in Colorado, but was born in the northwest suburbs of Chicago and has spent most of his life there. He has worked in a handful of different industries over the years, largely sales and service-based, ensuring that he never loses the common touch. The Dreamer's Quarry is his debut novel, and it will not be the last. Today, we'll be hearing from The Dreamer's Quarry, a poignant exploration of one man's struggle to navigate adult life, find his place in the world, and answer the call of his artistic soul. Warner dreams of literary success, yearning to capture the essence of the human experience with his words. But reality keeps intruding. The soul-crushing sales job, mounting bills, and the weight of providing for his young family. His once bright passion dims under the pressure to conform to a society that values profit over art. Warner must confront deep-seated fears and self-doubt that threaten to extinguish his dreams. Let's welcome now Michael.
I'm just gonna jump right into it. It's probably a smaller excerpt. My book is not that long in length, so I don't want to give too much of it away. But I chose this passage because I think it is integral without giving anything too much away. So Warner stepped out of a cab, looking down a hill, down the winding street toward the horizon, a greater view of the setting sun and the city skyline visible by a sliver over the tops of the trees from his place upon the hill. The coming dusk was now almost dark, as the last stroke of sunlight was thinning in the sky beyond. the city lights theatrically brighter in the distance as the day faded. Thank you, he said, passing a folded sum of cash to the driver through the open window. Thanks, man. Have a good night, the cab driver replied. Warner stepped aside as the engine sounded, the tires peeling away from the curb, and the car was off down the beautifully clad boulevard. He waited peacefully in the silence. The further the sound of the cab engine, the more muffled it became, in contrast to the silence of the evening air and the pocketed neighborhood. The dollop of sunlight that remained seemed to fade by the second. The summer night swelled about him in a romantic flare of warmth and poise. He looked up and down the street with parked cars on either side. He wondered for a moment how many of them might be for Jameson's evening affair, and how many were simply there most of the time. Marching up upon the sidewalk, he came to a short column of shallow cement steps in the clearing of a Gothic iron fence, the bottom of his shoes clicking along the ascent and onto a cobblestone walkway before a massive Victorian home on a lot that was landscaped to aesthetic perfection. Vivaciousness hearkened from within, and the sounds of similar events seemed to hover in the air as the great houses whispered amongst one another about the stirrings within. Warner paused at the front door, pulling stiff the hem of his linen blend sport coat. He stood quietly outside the door, hesitant to walk in on his own, but was also hesitant in bringing too much attention to himself by ringing the doorbell. He straightened his tie, and just then he heard footsteps behind the door, a clink of the handle, and the door swayed open. There was a tall, lean fellow, not quite lanky but narrower in physique, standing in the doorway just past the threshold. He sported a Hamburg-style hat that he tipped to Warner in a tipsy sort of manner, raising his glass up to his curled handlebar mustache, sipping from it. It was as if he was some storybook character, but he pulled it off quite well. His confidence, of course, procuring its acceptance. "Hello, hello," said the stranger in a raised voice. It was lively within. "Hello," Warner replied. "You must be the new chap," the man stated. He stepped aside and welcomed Warner inward, with no other words necessary in reasoning him being there. Warner stepped in with a confidence of his own, and the man shut the door behind him. "Is Jameson here?" Warner inquired. The man looked about the place, as if the man in question were somewhere in sight, and waved his glass in an arch. "He's around here somewhere." He walked off with purpose, as if to get back to something, and without turning, "There's an open bar in the back. Help yourself." Warner looked about stoically for a moment, catching a couple of brows while he stood at the door and thought it best to stand at the one place it wasn't unusual to stand at alone. He sauntered through the next room to the right of the foyer, passing through another room behind it until he reached what looked to be the back of the house, where he spotted the bar. There was a man standing behind it in black trousers and a black polo with fiery red hair, leaning against the back wall with his arms and legs crossed, waiting for someone to require something of him. He had the look of a bartender that only ever made things well, or rather right, as one could likely imagine him saying. Warner approached the bar, catching his eye, and they nodded at one another. "What would you like?" the bartender asked. "A Manhattan, please. Up or on the rocks?" "Up." "Sure." The man got to business with a faint, satisfied smile, looking everything over with a tilt of his head and spotting the stirring glass, breezed about the task. He strained the cocktail into a coupe, he said, sliding the chilled libation forward on a small black napkin. "Thank you, I appreciate it." Warner pulled a couple of dollars from his pocket, and they both nodded at the exchange. He stepped over to the end of the bar where he could stand in social etiquette and security. He peered into the rooms that he could see from his vantage point and watched discreetly as people sat and conversed or moved about. He always enjoyed people watching and the occasional eavesdropping. He sipped from his glass for many minutes, and the bartender lifted his index finger toward the cocktail. "That vermouth makes for a great Manhattan." He stepped forward and picked up the bottle, displaying it to Warner. "Antica Carpano. It's too good," he smiled. "It's excellent," Warner replied. "You do this full time?" "I work at a cocktail bar and I take private gigs sometimes from people that come in. It's easy money." "Nice," said Warner. "Are you into the mixology thing?" "We're all just bartenders," the man grinned. "Anyone that calls them a mixologist is probably just a prick." They chuckled. Warner smiled widely. "Fair enough. Are you waiting for someone?" "The host, actually." Warner looked around. "I'm a stranger here." "He's around here somewhere. He'll probably stop by for a drink soon. Do you have his number?" "It's all right." "How'd you meet?" Warner sipped from his glass. "I met him at a party." "Classic," the bartender smiled. "Does he have a habit of meeting strangers at parties?" People have a habit of meeting him, and they all know him to whatever degree he lets them. Man of intrigue, Warner postulated, with a slight tilt of his head. Unlike tonight, he's usually known for his Irish goodbyes. Likes the mystique? He's like a ghost that everyone likes, and he turns up from time to time, or invites them over for a party just to have a good time. He grinned as Warner finished his drink. His pals are over there, though, at the table in the kitchen. I see. Warner pushed his glass forward toward the inside of the bar. Is there a place I can smoke? Everyone that does smoke has been going out back. The bartender pointed his thumb toward a door between the bar and the kitchen. Warner stepped out for a cigarette and returned to the bar where he previously stood. Do you want another? Please, Warner stated, handing the man another tip. They nodded at one another again, and the man went skillfully about his craft with efficiency and confidence in a distinguished stance. Are you indifferent to cherries? The bartender asked, looking at the cherry left in his glass while straining the new cocktail. I am. The bartender, instead of threading 2 cherries to garnish the drink, dipped his bar spoon into the sauce of a cherry can, drizzled it in a circular fashion over top of the glass, and gave it a short stir. He slid the cocktail toward Warner. Thank you. You're welcome, the man replied. A few moments passed as Warner stood alone at the bar. As the bartender made light conversation with him out of courtesy and charm, Warner had taken notice that the men around the table in the kitchen were eyeing him. He kept a straight face when he observed them and maintained a look of indifference, while continuing cordial conversation with the bartender who had also noticed. One of the men at the table, fair-haired and sharply dressed, sitting with the man in the Homburg hat to his left, motioned to him. Warner and the bartender acknowledged the request, and he walked over to them confidently, but without too heavy a sternness as to warrant a mood of trouble. Warner stood before them, and they were silent. Yes? Warner asked. Are you the writer? The fair-haired man asked. They all looked him over. Possibly, Warner replied. He told us to be on the lookout for you. You want to sit with us? Warner looked around the table and drew back an empty seat. Why not? He sat quietly, listening and observing as they finished their light-hearted banter. The man in the Homburg hat faced Warner squarely at the table. So what is it that you write? I'm writing a novel. What's it about? The fair-haired man asked, and Warner explained as briefly as was possible. They all raised their glasses and drank in his honor. But I'm not a writer yet. What we are striving to be is always who we really are. What are you all striving to be? Warner replied. Musician, said the man in the Homburg hat. Photographer, said another. Professional drinker, the fair-haired man replied, getting up for another round, and a lot of them laughing promptly. I see you've met the crew, came a strong voice in the presence of a man in a dark navy pinstripe sport coat, expertly tailored. He looked just as notable as the rest of them, but in a distinguished subtlety. He held his hand out in welcome, and Warner met it firmly with his own. They were just looking for you, said the fair-haired man, returning with another libation. Who? Jameson asked, looking around coolly. The squirrels that think are nuts. The fair-haired man replied. They all chuckled at the silliness of the joke. They talked, and Jameson sketched away on a large sketch pad, looking intently at each one of them, occasionally setting it face down on the table before them whenever he took a break. They talked about the life. They talked about the struggle and being different from almost everyone you've ever met, and being thought ill of in some vague capacity to their lack of conformity, well aware that conformity was for cowards, and that uniformity among difference was the more virtuous and truthful. They talked about how their kind dealt more easily with asinine criticism because their whole existence was full of it, but they never would have imagined the magnitude of it in their adulthood, or its restless duration. At the end of every day, they were still simply, or not so simply, to whatever their lives entailed, striving to be a steadfast husband, a strong father, an honorable son, a faithful brother, a wise friend, a graceful neighbor, an upright citizen, and a formidable man. They spoke about these things while also managing to pay the mortgage or rent, keep gas in the car, have food on the table, have clothes to wear, present a comely home, pay the insurance on everything, all of it while showing up every day to a soul-sucking job that they'll always hate, no matter what they do. They'll say it's fine, even good, when people ask, moonlighting at best to hopefully become something that everyone else tells them is foolish or vague and highly unlikely. You spend your whole life giving chase to the things that purposed the very best of you, that brought you life and burst it from you, things that other people could not do nearly as well or at all, while society cultivated the collective resolve to simply go to a university or take up a common job. There was no real fault in that either. It was certainly easier, compensated to varying degrees, mapped out, and well trodden. However, it was the disdain that they had for you, and the admiration that they had for those hailed before you, who were once upon a time just like you, that presented a logical conundrum and many fractured feelings over time, sometimes, sadly, even a splintered reputation, and a rejection of the fine qualities that you did truly possess. Every night was a thoughtful and more frequently emotional examination of how close you were to proving yourself. And every night that you were not yet who you wanted to be, who you were so sure that you were, left a lingering fear in the back of your mind that maybe they're right, and no one could relate to it, save for a few rogues.
Thank you so much, Michael. And I just want to say you have such an excellent narrating voice, so that was a very captivating reading. So thank you for sharing that with us. At this time, we do have time for our audience
Thank you.
Q&A. So for anyone who has a question, please go ahead and type those in the chat, and I'll make sure they get asked. This first question is for all three authors. And the question is, how did your personal experiences or background influence the themes in your book? I'm thinking we could go in reading order. So Charlie, do you want to start us off with this one?
Yeah, when I was trying to publish the book, which I finished in draft of in 2015. I had a literary agent who's kind of flirting with it, tell me I can't sell this because it's too secular for a Christian publisher and it's too Christian for a secular publisher. And yeah, my biological father was a pastor, as you might have picked up from the chapter, but he also loved the Rolling Stones and Woody Allen, and was just a real person. You might have picked up on some kind of bipartisan themes in that chapter that I read. And so, yeah, I had grown up in a family that was able to appreciate diversity, still have conviction about life and how we thought it should be lived. So that kind of just worldview. I grew up in Chugwater, Wyoming, which is a town of about 200 people. So it was a very small town, but we traveled a lot as family, and my parents raised us with an awareness of the world outside it. So I wanted to write a story that kind of told that worldview.
Absolutely. And I think that's, part of what makes a world, even if it's the real world, but in a book, a world feels so realistic. So I think that's a great way to just make it so lived in. Anne, what about you? How did your personal experiences or your background influence the themes that came out in your book?
Am I on?
Yeah.
Well, I spent 12 years in Catholic schools with a lot of nuns, and I sometimes would think about them, and wonder what happened. Like, were the young ones, were they still there? And it was interesting because a lot of people really disliked the nuns, and I never did. I just thought they were good people and that they would tell good stories. And I think that that's a reward in itself. So I started writing, like just picking out a couple nuns' names and, and came up with Catherine, who really, I think that she understood the sisters more than most people did. And when she went to work with them after she got her sentence, she worked like crazy doing stuff for them, and they were great to her and to all the people they took care of, which is, pretty amazing, kind of heavy stuff. So I just thought it was really interesting that, in my old age, I still like the nuns.
Well, it kind of harkens back to that idea that truth is stranger than fiction. Maybe in this case, more interesting is a better way to put it. But I can totally see where that inspiration would come from, considering that. Michael, what about you? How did your personal experiences or your background influence the themes in your book?
Yeah, I think I mean, the story is kind of just the troped story of the starving artist, as people would probably call it. I think that a lot of the things that I wrote about are not unique or specific to me, and yet if they are, it's also something that's probably specific to what would you call the archetype of an artistic person, you know? But I definitely leaned into it for sure and pulled from, you know, thoughts and emotions that you have in hours of introspection and whatnot. So,
Yeah, I mean, there are these experiences that might be so commonly shared across the human, um, general human experience, but I think there's those unique flavors that each individual person brings to the art for it. So I'm sure, that kind of comes through in its own way. This next question, also for all three authors, was there a particular scene or chapter that was especially meaningful or difficult to write? And do you want to start us off this time?
Um, yeah, yeah, so my book has a prologue and an epilogue, and I can't, it sounds ridiculous, but I can't finish reading it without tears, you know? It just, there are things like that. And it's a place where you get all the information that you finally need and want. So it's it, it really helped me a lot. I never thought of using a prologue and an epilogue, but I really think it worked. So that's good.
Yeah, that really speaks to how impactful not only for other readers that the work is, but this artwork is so impactful for you as well. I think that's a very valuable piece to any artist's work. Michael, what about you? A particular scene or chapter that was especially meaningful or difficult to write?
I think it's very dialogue heavy. My book, it's kind of a character driven piece. And so I think it was just being meticulous about what these characters would actually think and feel and say, and what's a normal human way to say it, and how would an actual dialogue go to make it believable instead of just pumping out my own themes through dialogue without integrating it very well or making it believable or making it realistic in any capacity, you know. And I think some people, you know, dialogue isn't always easy, but I think it comes natural to me. So it was just making sure that all of that was very pristine, you know.
Yeah, it's that ultimate commitment to, picking apart every single little detail and making sure it's exactly the way you want it to sit. And Charlie, also for you, was there a particular scene or chapter that was especially meaningful or difficult to write?
Um, kind of all of them. It was pretty personal book. One that kind of stands out. My 3 months after I was born, my mom found my biological father having a seizure on our bathroom floor, and that's how they found out that he had a brain tumor. So the premise of the chapter is that he's she hears this big thud on the bathroom floor. She's goes in, sees what's going on. And while he's having the seizure, he's giving the best sermon he ever gave, or the next day, Sunday, he's going to about to give the best sermon he ever gave. And so then I had to write the sermon. And then at the end of the chapter, the line reads something like, "It was the best sermon he gave, but he never got to give it because the seizure erased his memory of having wrote it." So that one was hard to write, but also kind of a nice opportunity for me to show up my dad because I wrote the best sermon that he ever gave.
Yeah, it's almost this interesting meta, but uh, super kind of grounded and introspective process. I think that must have been I would, pay to be a fly on the wall in your brain as that's happening. I'm sure that was very fascinating.
Yeah, thanks.
Um, yeah, so now we have time for just one more question. This is one more question for all three authors again. What was the process like to write an entire novel? I'm especially interested to hear this because a lot of writers, transition from short story to long format. But even for writers that don't, I think this is a really interesting thing to hear about. So, Michael, if you want to start us off this time, the process of writing your entire novel.
I rewrote the whole thing 3 times. um, I kind of, mm, I just really went for it. Like I knew I had written some short stories, none of them published or anything. Just kind of to give it a go and see kind of what my capabilities are. Shared them with a few people, and I know that a common advice is to start off with a short story, kind of master that so you understand story arc and it's not too daunting, and then go transition to a book. Um, I feel like, if you got a book in you, you got a book in you. Mine's obviously not very long, but I just went for it and read it over again and again, rethought themes, made sure I liked, you know, what was being said. I kind of was always, if I was ever going to make some sort of like philosophical assertion or anything, I wanted to make sure that would I change my mind on this particular issue 10 years from now? You know what I mean? Like, would I be thinking something differently? I think that had a lot, there was a lot um, of that kind of thinking that went into it and just putting in the work. I think it can seem daunting, so you never start. You know what I mean? And I think just showing up, it's like, what did Hemingway say? Writing's like mass. God gets mad when you don't show up. I think it's part of it's just being present. I think for those, sometimes you get ideas, sometimes you don't. Sometimes you bang out a lot in a 45-minute session, and sometimes you sit there for 2.5 hours and you're like, I've maybe got a sentence, you know. But it's just showing up and putting in the work. And like I said, if you got a book in you, you got a book in you. Just chase it down, get it done.
Absolutely. It really is kind of disciplined work, I think, that it comes down to no matter what else, what other factors you're dealing with, it's just that consistency. Um, Charlie, what about you? What was the process of writing an entire novel?
Yeah, the short answer, which I'm not always great at giving, but I'll try, was it was, yeah, very painstaking until it was rewarding, and then it became fun. And I'm glad I got to follow up Michael because I really resonate with what he said. I realized about a year and a half into writing the book and making myself feel really bad for kind of judging my success or failures by how many words I had written each day. I think I kind of turned a corner when I realized it doesn't matter if you write 2,000 words in 90 minutes and they're not any good, then that's not as much progress as spending 5 hours writing 200 really good words. So that kind of shift in my mindset of like, just like Michael was saying, just showing up and just spending time with it. And even if something wasn't working, you took the time to go through that mental process and figure out what didn't work.
Absolutely. Allowing yourself that space, I think, can be a huge turning point once an author gets to that, just like you said, Charlie. And closing us out, what was it like for you, the process of writing this entire novel?
Um, it, it was really difficult. I think it was sitting around for maybe 9 years, and I would pull it out every once in a while and try to make changes, and then just just one day I said, "Hey, this is pretty good." Like after years of this, I said, "This is pretty good," and I showed it to people, and they said, "Oh yeah." So that
Yeah,
was. I think I think part of it is, as I said before, that I started with the nuns, and I just really enjoyed that thing of, hanging around with the nuns for a while. So that helped a lot too. You got to find your characters, you got to find out who's going to come up to bat.
yeah, if you've got good characters, that means you've got good company and you're gonna need that to
Yeah.
get through the whole thing. So
Yeah, I
I
found
think
them
that,
really enjoyable.
yeah,
Like something would just come out on the page and I'd say, "Oh, did I say that or did she say that?" And of course it's, you're just imagining things, but
but
it's
I
good.
think it's, the sign of a great character when they're really coming to life and doing their own thing like that. So I
Mhm.
think it's definitely a good sign there. So at this point, I just want to say that it was so wonderful to hear all three of the books today brought to life in the voices of their creators. So thank you so much to Charlie, Anne, and Michael for being generous with your time, your words, and your thoughts today. Thank you to everyone in the audience also for joining us and celebrating these wonderful authors together. Don't forget that you can order Where Heaven Meets Cheyenne, St. Catherine of Secaucus, and The Dreamer's Quarry from the links in the chat. I'll actually put them in there one more time for everybody just so they are immediately accessible. Please also consider checking out atmospherepress.com to browse our new and forthcoming releases, sign up for our email newsletter, or submit a book manuscript of your own. You can submit your work to books@atmospherepress.com and just let us know that you attended today's event. We'll look forward to hearing from you, but until then, that's it for tonight. So have a great rest of your week, everyone.